Something quiet has been happening beneath the surface of modern relationships, and most men won't notice it until it's already rewritten the terms of their entire life. It doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where she sits you down and explains the architecture of what's actually occurring. Instead, it happens in fragments. A comment that seems playful but lands with just enough edge to make you second-guess yourself. A sudden coldness after you've been nothing but available. A test disguised as a question. A boundary you didn't know existed until you crossed it, and now the air between you has changed in a way you can't quite name. You've felt this, even if you've never had the language for it. That subtle recalibration of power that happens when a woman introduces chaos into what you thought was stability. When she pulls back after you've leaned in, when she creates distance precisely because you've been too close, when her attraction seems to spike, not when you're consistent and dependable, but when you're distracted, busy, or most confusingly, when you care just a little bit less. And the most disorienting part is that none of this follows the logic you were taught. You were told that love rewards presence, investment, and emotional availability, that if you show up consistently enough, the relationship will deepen and her respect will follow. But the pattern you're living inside tells a different story entirely. I work with men who describe this experience with an almost identical vocabulary. They talk about feeling like they're constantly being measured against a standard that was never explained to them, like they're playing a game where the rules shift based on performance they can't see. One man told me he felt like he was walking on a floor that kept disappearing under his feet, and every time he adjusted his footing, the ground moved again. He wasn't angry. He was exhausted, and beneath the exhaustion was something more dangerous. The slow erosion of his certainty about who he actually was. Because when you spend enough time trying to pass tests you don't understand, you eventually forget what you stood for before the testing began. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this long before we had dating apps and attachment theory. He spent much of his work dissecting the mechanisms of power, value, and how human beings determine what and who is worth pursuing. And one of his most surgical observations was this: that we assign value not based on inherent worth, but based on difficulty of attainment and the presence of resistance. The thing that yields too easily, that makes itself too available, that requires no effort to obtain this thing quietly loses its status in our eyes. We may not admit this. We may not even be conscious of it. But the pattern repeats across every domain of human desire. The book you can read anytime sits unread. The gym membership you can access whenever you want gets ignored, and the man who is always available, always accommodating, always willing to rearrange his life to fit hers, this man becomes the emotional equivalent of furniture. Useful, comfortable, taken for granted, and ultimately replaceable. Here is the thesis that will run beneath everything that follows, and if you understand it fully, it will reframe every confusing interaction you've ever had. A man who makes himself too available, who removes all resistance, who collapses his boundaries in the name of love or connection, does not inspire deeper attraction. He triggers the opposite. He activates a biological and psychological mechanism in which his value is unconsciously recalculated downward, and her respect for him quietly begins to disappear. This is not cruelty. This is not manipulation. This is the way human desire has been structured for millennia. And the man who doesn't understand it will spend his entire life confused about why his effort produces distance instead of closeness. Nietzsche called this the will to power, the fundamental drive in all living things, not merely to survive, but to expand, to test, to overcome resistance. And in the context of romantic dynamics, this drive expresses itself in women as an unconscious need to measure the strength, boundaries, and psychological resilience of the men they encounter. She is not doing this out of malice. She is doing this because her biology and her psyche are designed to filter for men who will not collapse under pressure, who will not abandon their frame the moment she introduces uncertainty, who possess something solid enough that her emotional weather cannot erode it. And the test is not a single event. It's a continuous, invisible process woven into the fabric of every interaction. Let me show you how this actually plays out. A man meets a woman. The early attraction is mutual, electric, and easy. He feels something he hasn't felt in a long time, and because it feels good, he leans into it. He starts texting her more. He rearranges his schedule to see her. He begins to make her the center of his emotional world, because that's what he's been told love looks like. Investment, presence, availability. But then something shifts. She starts responding less frequently. Her tone cools. She mentions another man casually, just enough to spike his anxiety. Or she cancels plans at the last minute with a reason that feels thin. And now the man is in a crisis he doesn't recognize as a crisis. His instinct is to close the distance, to text more, to ask what's wrong, to reassure her, to fix whatever invisible problem has emerged, and in doing so he steps directly into the mechanism Nietzsche described. Because what she is doing, whether consciously or not, is testing the structure of his frame. She is introducing uncertainty to see if he will hold his ground or collapse into anxiety. She is pulling back to see if he will chase or remain centered. She's creating distance to see is whether his sense of self is independent of her proximity or exists independent of her proximity. And most men fail this test, not because they are weak, but because they are operating from the wrong instruction manual. They think this is a test of how much he cares, but it's actually a test of whether he is psychologically sovereign, whether his internal world remains stable when hers shifts, whether he can tolerate her emotional weather without becoming destabilized by it. Nietzsche wrote that one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. What he meant was that greatness, strength, and authentic vitality require the ability to hold tension, to endure disorder, to remain intact under pressure. And in the architecture of attraction, this translates directly. The man who can hold his frame when she introduces chaos, who does not collapse into pleading or anxiety, who allows her to feel what she feels without rushing in to fix it, this man signals something essential. He signals that he is not easily moved, his value does not fluctuate based on her mood, that he has something in his life larger than her, and that his mission, his purpose, his center of gravity exists whether she stays or goes. But the man who chases, who over-explains, who sacrifices his schedule and his self-respect in an attempt to close the distance she has created, this man signals the opposite. He signals that his internal state is dependent on hers, that he has no center beyond her approval, that the withdrawal of her attention can control him. And once this pattern is established, her attraction begins to die, not because she is cruel, but because attraction itself is rooted in the perception of strength, autonomy, and scarcity. The man who makes himself too available, who removes all barriers, who behaves as though his entire world revolves around her, this man has inadvertently destroyed the very conditions that attraction requires. Let me take you deeper into the mechanism, because understanding the surface is not enough. You need to see what happens inside the man's psyche as this collapse unfolds. It begins with a small negotiation. She does something that bothers him. Maybe she disrespects his time, or flirts with another man in front of him, or speaks to him in a tone that crosses a line. And in that moment, he has a choice. He can address it clearly and hold his boundary, which would require accepting the possibility that she might react badly, pull away, or leave. Or he can suppress his discomfort, tell himself it's not a big deal, and let it pass to keep the peace. Most men choose the second option, not because they are cowards, but because they are terrified of loss. And that single moment of self-abandonment is the first brick in a structure that will eventually bury him. Because once he crosses that threshold, once he chooses her comfort over his own integrity, the script is written. The next time she tests a boundary, he folds again and again, and with each fold, he trains her nervous system to understand that his boundaries are negotiable, his words do not match his actions, that he can be managed, manipulated, or safely ignored. And worse, he trains himself to believe that his own needs are secondary, that his discomfort is a problem to be suppressed rather than information to be honored. He starts apologizing for things he didn't do wrong. He starts explaining himself when no explanation was requested. He starts monitoring her moods like a stock ticker, adjusting his behavior in real time to keep her regulated. And in this process, he becomes a man she cannot respect because he has stopped respecting himself. Nietzsche would call this slave morality, the psychological posture of the man who has internalized his own inferiority, who has accepted the frame that his value is determined by another's approval, who operates from fear and resentment rather than from strength and self-possession. And the tragedy is that the man doing this often believes he is being loving. He thinks his flexibility, his willingness to accommodate, and his willingness to sacrifice his own boundaries are proof of his devotion. But it's not devotion, it's self-erasure. And self-erasure does not inspire love. It inspires contempt, quiet, unconscious, often denied, but contempt nonetheless. I once spoke to a man who had been in a relationship for 3 years. He described a pattern where every time he tried to set a boundary or express a need, his partner would become cold, distant, or emotionally punishing until he backed down. And he always did, because he was terrified that standing firm would mean losing her. But here's what he didn't see. He had already lost her, not because she left, but because the version of himself that she might have respected had been slowly dismantled, piece by piece, in the name of keeping her close. By the time he came to me, he couldn't remember the last time she had initiated sex. She criticized him constantly. She made decisions without consulting him. And when he finally tried to leave, she panicked and promised to change, not because she loved him, but because she had grown dependent on his utility. He was the infrastructure of her life, the man who paid for things, who managed logistics, who absorbed her emotional chaos. But he was not the man she desired, and once he understood that distinction, everything clarified. The contrasting story is always revealing. The man she later pursued after he finally left looked similar on the surface. Same income bracket, same physical build, but the difference was in how he moved through the world. He didn't seek her approval. He didn't rearrange his life around her schedule. When she tested him, he didn't flinch. He didn't chase her when she pulled back. He maintained his mission, friendships, gym routine, and boundaries. As a result, she experienced him as scarce as valuable, as someone she had to work to keep, and her attraction was immediate and overwhelming. In a way, it had never been with the man who had given her everything. Now zoom out, because this is not just about individual men and women. This is about a systemic pattern that is accelerating across the entire architecture of modern dating and relationships. We live in an environment that actively punishes masculine initiative while demanding it. That tells men to be vulnerable while offering no protection for that vulnerability. That incentivizes women to delay commitment, maximize optionality, and treat relationships as auditions rather than partnerships. Dating apps have gamified attraction into a slot machine of infinite choice, where the next swipe might be better, where commitment feels like foreclosing on potential. Social media has created a public performance layer where relationships are curated for external validation rather than internal coherence. And beneath it all is a legal and cultural infrastructure that makes long-term commitment, marriage, and fatherhood increasingly high risk, low reward for men. Nietzsche saw the seeds of this in his own time. He wrote about the last man, the figure who seeks comfort above all else, who avoids suffering and risk, who has grown small and risk-averse because his culture no longer demands greatness. The last man blinks. He does not fight. He does not build. He does not pursue anything beyond his immediate comfort. And in our time, this figure has become the norm. Men are withdrawing not because they are lazy or broken, but because the game itself has become poisoned. Because the cost of engagement, emotional, financial, legal, reputational, has outpaced the reward. And the men who are still playing are increasingly doing so from a position of weakness, scarcity, and self-abandonment, which only accelerates their irrelevance. If you are a man who has felt this, if you have felt the ground shifting under you, if you have felt the exhaustion of being constantly tested and never quite passing, if you have felt your self-respect eroding in real time as you try to hold together a relationship that requires you to become smaller, then you need to hear this clearly. The system is not designed for your flourishing. The scripts you were given about love and partnership were written in a different era, for a different structure, and they do not apply to the environment you are navigating. And if you continue to operate from those scripts, you will keep losing, not because you are weak, but because you are playing a game whose rules have changed and no one told you. Here's the cost of staying blind. You will spend the next decade of your life in a state of low-grade confusion and resentment. You will attract women who sense your lack of boundaries and treat you accordingly. You will give more and more of yourself and receive less and less in return. You will lose your mission because it will become her mood. You will lose your friendships because you will cancel on them whenever she needs you. You will lose your body because the gym will become optional and comfort will become your drug. And eventually, you will lose the part of yourself that still remembers what you wanted before you started negotiating for scraps of affection from someone who was never going to respect you anyway. But here's the other path, the one that requires initiation. The one that asks you to stop lying to yourself about what's happening and start moving like a man who understands the game. Notice when you feel the pull to chase, that impulse to send another text, to ask what's wrong, to close the distance she has created. And instead of acting on it, sit with discomfort. Let her pull back. Let the silence stretch. See what happens when you stop managing her emotions and start trusting that she is an adult capable of deciding what she wants. Most of the time, the space you create will either bring her back with renewed interest or reveal that her interest was never genuine to begin with. Either outcome is beneficial. Stop pretending that your needs don't matter. If she disrespects your time, say so. If she crosses a boundary, name it. If she creates drama to test whether you will hold your frame, keep it. And if she walks away because you refuse to collapse, let her walk. Because a woman who cannot handle your boundaries is a woman who will never respect you, and a relationship without respect is just elaborate captivity. Nietzsche wrote that he who has a reason to live can bear almost any how. Your why cannot be her. It has to be something larger, something that exists whether she is there or not. Your work, your purpose, your mission, the man you are becoming. And when that is in place, her presence becomes optional rather than essential, and that shift in frame is what makes you valuable. Refuse to argue your value. If you find yourself explaining why you deserve respect, why you matter, why she should prioritize, you stop. You have already lost. Value is demonstrated, not argued. And the man who has to convince a woman of his worth has already accepted a frame in which his worth is in question. Instead, move like a man who knows his value and is simply observing whether she can recognize it. If she is, great. Suppose she's not. That's information. And information is more valuable than validation. Allow her to react while you remain anchored. She will test you. She will create uncertainty. She will introduce chaos to see if you will panic. And your job is not to fix it, manage it, or collapse under it. Your job is to remain centered, to hold your ground, to let her feel what she feels without taking responsibility for it. Because when you do this, you communicate something that words cannot, that you are not afraid of her emotional weather, that you have something solid in you to withstand it. And that solidity is what attraction locks onto. Begin to move as if your life belongs to you, not to her approval. Make plans based on what you want to build, not on what will keep her happy. Protect your time like it's the most valuable resource you have, because it is. Say no when you need to. Prioritize your mission even when it disappoints her, and watch what happens. In most cases, you will discover that the respect you were begging for suddenly appears the moment you stop seeking it. Not because she changed, but because you did. Let me show you two futures. In the first, you ignore everything you just heard. You decide that this is too harsh, too cold, too transactional. You convince yourself that love should be softer than this, that boundaries are unromantic, that real connection requires total availability. And so you continue down the path you're already on. 5 years from now, you are still with someone or cycling through versions of someone who treats you like infrastructure. Your friends have stopped calling because you cancel on them too many times. Your body has softened because discipline felt like too much effort. Your work has stalled because you've been too distracted managing the emotional weather of someone who never asked you to. And the worst part is not that you're unhappy, it's that you've forgotten what happiness felt like. You become a stranger in your own life, and the quiet contempt you feel from her is just the echo of the contempt you've been directing at yourself for years. In the second future, you take this as the initiation it is. You stop waiting for permission to live like a man who matters. You rebuild your boundaries one decision at a time. You start saying no. You return to the gym, not because you're trying to attract someone, but because you're trying to remember what strength feels like. You reconnect with your mission, even if it's still blurry, even if you don't know exactly what it is yet. You start moving through the world as though your value is a fact, not a negotiation. And within 6 months, everything shifts. Some women leave. Good. They were never going to respect you anyway. But others appear, and they appear differently curious, responsive, engaged. Not because you're performing some manipulative strategy, but because you're finally congruent. Your words match your actions. Your boundaries are real, and the quiet authority that comes from self-respect is more magnetic than any script or technique could ever be. This path is more challenging. It is lonelier at first. You will lose people. You will face rejection. You will have to sit with discomfort rather than medicate it with the temporary validation of someone who doesn't actually value you. But it is the only path that preserves your dignity. The only path is here. You get to look at yourself in the mirror 10 years from now and recognize the man looking back. Here is the thesis again, stripped to its bones. A man who collapses his boundaries, who makes himself endlessly available, who prioritizes her emotional weather over his own sovereignty, does not inspire love. He triggers the biological and psychological mechanisms that recalibrate his value downward, and her respect quietly dies. This is not cruelty. This is the structure of desire itself. And the man who refuses to learn this will spend his entire life confused about why his devotion produces distance, why his effort generates contempt, and why the more he gives, the less he receives. She does not destroy your purpose. She reveals its absence. If a woman can destabilize your entire life with a mood swing or a moment of distance, the problem is not her. The problem is that you built your life on sand, that you never anchored yourself to something larger than her approval, that you mistook dependency for love and self-abandonment for devotion. And the moment you stop blaming her and start rebuilding your foundation is the moment your life begins again. If this hits something in you, if you feel the recognition of a pattern you've been living inside without naming, then share this. Send it to the men in your life who need to hear it. Subscribe and keep this work alive, because there are thousands of men out right now, sitting alone, wondering why everything they were taught about love has failed them, and they need to know they're not crazy. They need to see that the game has rules, and that the rules can be learned. You were never taught how to be wanted, you were taught how to be useful.